What I remember most is the smell. I'll never forget it. It was a combination of campfire, caramel corn, and melted plastic and electrical wire. We drove along the snowy gravel road through the woods up to our driveway in our sage green station wagon, the kind with the wood panels on the side. I was 5 years old. The only thing left of our home was a pile of black sticks strewn willy-nilly in a huge heap. I don't remember how long it had been since the night of the fire and the day we went back, maybe, a day or two, long enough that we'd found some clothes to wear and some shoes, likely donated by a local church. The night of the fire, we'd been awoken in the middle of the night, wee hours, with choking black smoke and flames coming out of the tops of the doorways. We barely got out, so all we had to wear was what we had escaped in, and in my case, a thin cotton nightgown. And we ran through the woods, barefoot, to the nearest neighbor, which was not so close. But now, the embers had cooled enough that we could walk through the rubble, and we tiptoed around black shapes and ashen beams that were leaning against what was left of the walls. My mother found where her bedroom had been, and she sifted through the ashes to see if she could find any of her jewelry. All she saw really as puddles of little melted metal parts. The house was all on one level, and my sister and I went to where our bedroom had been. We found our dog, Grendel. She was laying in the middle of a black, empty frame where a mattress had been. In fear, she'd run under the bed and become trapped. And there she was, this black, sleeping shape, unmistakably her. She was a Weimaraner, sweet, silver, elegant dog with the long snout and the long, floppy ears. It's a breed also referred to as the gray ghost. I crouched down and I reached in and I pulled out one of her charred ribs, and I took it back to the station wagon and I wrapped it in a McDonald's napkin to take home. We'd lost everything that night. We had to start all over. We ended up in a small, depressing, empty apartment. My mother went through a really deep depression. She barely got out of bed. My grandmother from Appalachia, North Carolina, came to visit, and she brought her sewing machine and some quilts that she'd made. My mother nailed them to her bedroom windows to keep every bit of light out. I don't remember my grandmother ever teaching me to sew, but I would watch her as she hunched over her sewing machine, and she would periodically spit tobacco juice in her Campbell's soup can. I don't know, one day I must have picked up a needle and thread and I gathered some of the scraps from around her feet and I cut out some shapes and I just figured out how to sew together little figures. Back then I stuffed them with toilet paper. Oh, and I had a basket and I'd collect any little thing that was shiny or like a button, beads, any types of fabrics that were especially comforting. I especially loved my mother's pantyhose. They were feminine, delicate, but strong and flexible, and they smelled like her perfume. And they made the perfect skin for my dolls. Everyone had known my mother as vivacious and elegant. She had a wit. She had a naughty sense of humor, but men and women loved her just the same. But she kind of disappeared. But these stockings were like proof of her in the before times. I had terrible panic attacks. I could barely get to school. I'd have to push myself against the frame of the doorway and they'd push me in and I'd be kicking and crying. One time I was so distraught trying to get away that I lost my balance and fell butt first into the waste paper basket and got stuck. Everybody laughed. I hated school. But when I'd get home, I had my basket, and I would sit in the floor, cross-legged, making my little figures, and I felt like I'd accomplished something. I felt a sense of pride. I made little figures of my mother dancing with a sequin smile. I made little figures that looked like happy families. I carved figures out of sticks. I made dolls out of dried apples for heads. I was alone a lot, but I never felt alone because these little scrappy figures were like my companions. It's like they were witness to all that was unspoken. And I think most of all, when I showed my mother, she laughed. There is a much debated question in the art world: what is art? Well, it's almost an impossible question to answer because there's so many factors to consider. A more interesting question, maybe a more useful question, is what is art for? Throughout history, across cultures, art has been for so many things. Record keeping, as a way to commemorate important people and events, as a way to signal status and wealth, as protest, as propaganda. But if you ask an artist what is art for, it's a much more complex and personal question. The artist Louise Bourgeois said art is a guarantee of sanity. That's been true for me. Imagine, if you will, you're walking through a museum, and all around the gallery is art by famous artists, household names. And as you walk through, you zero in on one particular piece, and you make some general observations. Is it uplifting, or is it more somber? Is it brightly colored, or is it more subdued? If it's a painting, you might make a note of the frame. Is it simple? Is it ornate? This might give you some indication of the time period in which it was made. Are there people crowded around it? This might influence you. Maybe they're taking pictures. Maybe you take a picture yourself. If you're really inspired, you might get up close and look at the detail. But then you'll probably scan the wall label quickly and then move on because there's so many things to see. What if the next time you went to a museum, you looked at a piece and asked yourself, what could this have been for? Did you know that the art of many famous artists, their medium, their subject matter, what you might call style, was developed in response to circumstances that they were going through, maybe difficult circumstances, things in their personal lives, or maybe things within the context of the time period they were going through, and that the art making was a way for them to process those difficult circumstances, which means that the art making was the way they processed, and the work itself is a record of that journey, a once-in-a-lifetime moment. For example, Picasso's famous Blue Period was a response to the death of his best friend. Claude Monet's style of fuzzy painting, light and shadow, was as a result of terrible eyesight. He had cataracts. And so it turns out his handicap is partly responsible for one of the most influential art movements of the 20th century, Impressionism. So art making all the way from cave paintings to present day has been one of the single most important things that the human race has had in helping us navigate change. I've come a long way since those days sitting on the floor making those little dolls. I've transitioned from careers in theater and dance. Once, during a production of West Side Story, I broke my ankle on stage in Scotland. They sent me home to recuperate. And while I was there, I instinctually started sewing again. And it became clear to me this relationship between mending and mending the body, mind, heart, spirit. I eventually devoted myself full-time to fine art. I'm now a contemporary artist. I make figurative sculptures that are very reminiscent of dolls. I've shown my work in museums and galleries, and it's collected all over the world. But they're not baby dolls, they're not fashion dolls, they're definitely not playthings. They've been described as confrontational, confidently bold, erotic, grotesque. I use vintage textiles, found objects, and sometimes even bone. Last year, I opened my own art gallery, and I founded the Doll Magic Academy of Figurative Sculpture, and I teach others to use doll making as a tool for self-transformation and healing. I've witnessed profound psychic healing in people, men and women, processing grief, illness, loneliness. Take, for example, a student of mine, I'll call her Susan. She came to my class after a long period of isolation following the pandemic. She was looking for connection, something unique and fun to do, and she was also struggling with her relationship with alcohol. But during the course of this class, she gave herself the gift of putting all of her usual distractions aside. She became more acquainted with her sense of play, her sense of spontaneity, her ability to feel free. She found her seat of intuition. She also fostered a supportive group of friends within the group. Or Maggie, who came to my class after a diagnosis of cancer, and instead of burying her fear or putting it aside, she created a self-portrait blooming with vitality and health. Because as we make, we become. And when we work with our hands, it's meditative, much like prayer beads. It opens up our ability to be receptive to possibility, maybe even the divine. I can't tell you what art is with any certainty, but if you asked me what is art for, I would say that art is a language available to anyone to help transform fear and confusion into something beautiful, to help us see the sublime in the mundane, and to gently guide ourselves through the chapters of our lives. Because how we make sense of a confusing world is the difference between a happy and an unhappy life. And having a creative outlet is one of the most healing, proactive things we can do for ourselves and the world. Because what we make, we become. Thank you.